Welcome to a new edition of the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino. On this episode, we talk with former journalist and author of Chained Birds, a true crime memoir. Her book has received a warm literary welcome, earning high praise from readers and editorial reviewers, including this blurb from a 5-star write-up by Manhattan Book Review. Carla Conti has penned a book destined to become a true crime classic. She used to have a career in journalism and saw many things firsthand. She blogs about prison reform. Her book and her publishing journey is all at carlajeanconti.com. We get into her full and fascinating story. Enjoy. Carla, great to meet you. Where are you located on the planet?
Thanks for having me, Joe. I am in Philadelphia.
Oh, the city of brotherly love,
Yes.
the land of John Coltrane. And I feel like Philadelphia has a really similar vibe to where I'm at in Kansas City, a real sports town, blue collar grit, a lot of integrity, a lot of culture, a lot going on.
Absolutely. Everything you just said is true. I couldn't have put it better.
So are you a sports fan?
I am forced to be a sports fan for Penn State due to my
Okay.
husband and the Eagles, of course. And
Yeah.
the Phillies. Yes.
Well, and I can't believe this year. I just really felt like they were going to go all the way. I mean, it just,
Oh, so disappointing for
oh,
so many people.
I
Yeah.
mean, they were just a hard charging bull, and then they got to that point. And it's weird because the Dodgers seemed like they were stalling and the Padres were going to beat them. And it makes me think that when like the Mets did really good and went way farther than anybody thought. I think when you keep playing, you just keep that momentum going. I think that when you stop, these big teams that win the division, when they stop for a while, they lose a little bit of their mojo.
I guess sounds like a good assessment.
It's a theory. It's a very meager theory. But at any rate, let's get into the world of writing. Let's get into the world that you exist in. And to begin that process, I want to know, I know we're getting fatigued by talking about it, but COVID was a big deal. Surviving a pandemic was a big deal. So tell me how you got through it and how it influenced your writing and what you do and how you live.
So, my book, Chained Birds, has a federal prisoner at the heart of it. And the book is about my 10-year journey with him, following him through federal prison and his criminal case. And he was due to be released during COVID. And I was one of the people who supported him on the outside, him and my attorney friend, Scott, who's the one that originally brought me into the case because Scott was his attorney. And he, the inmate, Kevin Sanders, did not get any halfway house time during COVID because everything was shut down. And so he had to serve out the rest of his sentence in his Florida prison. And he could have otherwise had maybe 12 months or 18 months in a halfway house that would have really helped his transition to the outside world. But that just was not able to be. And so we struggled with ways to try to help him during COVID. And we were on one side of the country, here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and he ended up getting released to the other side of the country in California. And it was very challenging to try to provide support from that standpoint. And at that point, I wasn't even committed to writing the book. I was just being an advocate for him. And it was a struggle to think about productive ways to spend your time. We were all doom scrolling on our phone, just frantic for good news, bad news, whatever news we could find about COVID and how it was being handled by the administration. And the only really productive thing I got done during that first spring, summer of COVID was work on my Ancestry.com family tree because it was something that I could pick up and discard and didn't require a lot of bandwidth, and I could have the news on in the background. And that's pretty much how I dealt with it in my household.
It's interesting. Every time I ask this question, it brings back memories that I'd kind of put and buried away. maybe because of just how weird that time was. But I do remember every morning just being like, am I going to look at a feed? Am I going to look into this? Because there was stretches where it was like, not only was there no like glimmer of hope, it would just get more plunged into some level of weirdness. And I was like, it was just that existential question. Do I want to do it because I want to be better informed and not be waylaid by a surprise news story? Or do I just lay off and let ignorance take over?
Exactly. Now,
Yeah.
have you been following some of the news stories about bird flu and it jumping into human populations?
I've seen that here and there, but not lately. I haven't noticed it.
The stories have been sparse, but they are there, and it is something on my radar. And I just have this nagging feeling that we're headed down this same ugly path with the new administration that this country is putting in charge again. And I don't know, maybe we'll be writing about that. I hope not.
Yeah, it's funny you mention that. It's like we all are these big electrical rods of sending out these vibes. And I was just thinking about that. Someone had mentioned the other day about just in general going back into that era of this new administration that we had been in before, and how everybody's perception was for the first few years, all of it, everything was just kind of this idyllic world, and then all of a sudden it got wrecked by it. And I'm thinking, what if a big thing comes in? Because this administration will dismantle anything that's preventative, that happens like that. Like the office that was set up to deal with SARS and COVID-18 was immediately dismantled, which didn't give a warning for 19. And that's what I'm thinking with you saying bird flu. If there's going to be levels of CDC and health that's going to be dismantled, there may be nothing on the radar that's going to warn us for this.
Possibly. I mean, you would think we could have learned from this past experience, but history tends to repeat itself. So that
Yeah.
doesn't bode well for us.
It does not. It does not. So, Carla, I want to get to the heart and soul of what you do on a daily basis. And I'm going to ask you this. I'm going to put you in front of a bunch of grade schoolers, third graders. It's career day. And one of the curious kids in the back of the room says, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" What's your answer?
Well, my answer is I am an author and I write books. And the subject of my book is definitely not appropriate for a third grade classroom. So maybe you'd have to put me in a high school classroom.
Let's do that.
Okay, right. Yeah, writing books. And it's a great way to get information out into the world. And I would tell them that it's an offshoot, really, of being a journalist and a reporter once upon a time, where I covered the police beat and criminal courts for a series of newspapers throughout the Midwest. Um, and it's a noble profession. It doesn't pay a lot, so maybe they ought to think about some higher paying careers, but it's noble.
Yeah, for sure. So, what was your dream? Let's go back from high school to the third grade. What was your dream when it came to career day? What did you think your life was going to turn out to be?
I did always want to be in the news industry. And when I was in high school and college, I actually studied broadcasting. And I did receive an invitation to go out to a very small TV station in Nebraska and interview for a job as I was finishing up college. But I had met my husband at the time, and he was very well cemented on the East Coast with an established career. So I never even went down that pathway. But I did end up in print journalism, which I loved doing. So I pretty much got to do what I wanted to do, and I think it ended up being better in the long run.
So, what was the small town in Nebraska?
I cannot remember the name.
Because
It would have had a TV station, a TV market. I mean, this was a long time ago,
sure,
Joe.
yeah, well, my excuse me, the engineer for my radio show, came from Lincoln, Nebraska, and always talks about Lincoln. And I just was thinking, I didn't know if it might have been that town because the only other one that
I
I
don't
know
know.
is Omaha. I don't know Omaha or yeah, I just don't know
Me
that
either.
Nebraska that well. So, but what were these seeds? Take me back to where you were born and raised. What were these seeds of journalism and investigative reporting? How did this become your life?
Gosh, that's a good question. I never wanted to do anything else. I suppose early on I realized that I was a pretty decent writer, English classes, etc. And I was always fascinated with news and became a news junkie. And I think it was just a natural offshoot of those two things. And prior to writing the book, I was my own blogger and pseudo journalist with my own website online. I did political blogs and things like that. So I always kept my hand in writing. And I was very close to publishing a true crime book a couple of decades ago. That was my first foray into publishing. And I even write about that in my current book, Chained Birds. And that will probably be my next book because I kept all the materials in boxes in my basement and recently unearthed them. And I have so many interviews and cassette tape recordings and all kinds of material that I think I can put together the book that I didn't get to publish back then.
So, who was a journalistic hero for you? Who'd you look up to?
Well, I guess because I was interested in broadcasting, I looked up to, oh gosh, Connie Chung and Leslie Stahl and Katie Couric and the women who were bringing great stories to television. I was influenced by them, but I was also very influenced by All the President's Men by, Woodward and Bernstein, not the book as much as the movie, and Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. Those were things that influenced me as a way of bringing journalism to a storytelling format. And I guess I just thought I could enter that world too.
So, what was the book for you growing up that you read, the first book that you read that really intrigued, blew you away, made you think, I want to read as much as I can or I want to write one day?
I would have to say In Cold Blood. Uh, and recently I found my old copy of that. I found my old copy of All the President's Men, which is a very tough, dry read to
Yeah.
get through. I mean, it does not compare to the movie, so the movie was much more inspirational for me. But yeah, I would say In Cold Blood was something that fascinated me and was really, one of those first storytelling formats that combine journalism and narrative nonfiction that is so prevalent today.
The thing that intrigues me the most about Truman Capote is that somehow he has become a central figure in a lot of people's books and kind of analyzing him and how he came up with this story and who he was. Because I didn't realize that him and Harper Lee were really close.
Oh, yeah, childhood friends. She wrote
Yeah,
about him in To Kill a Mockingbird.
yeah, and he was the one that encouraged her to write it. And I believe that was one of the only books that she ever wrote. She wasn't a prolific writer.
No, no. And, I read an article not long ago about how a manuscript had been found in her home long after she passed away. And I believe she wrote it before she wrote um, To Kill a Mockingbird.
Wow.
And it involved some of the same characters. And I believe that whoever she passed it on to, I think the editorial suggestions were to take that manuscript in a different way, tell it from a different perspective. And then that became To Kill a Mockingbird. But she was one and done. I mean,
Yeah,
that was it from
yeah,
her.
that was it. So I
Yeah.
got to know, as somebody that's dealt with reality and this world we live in 2024 has increasingly become a place where you just can't believe things are happening the way they are. And my lead into my question is this. Is somebody that loves fiction, that writes nonfiction, that's written nonfiction for a long time, do you believe that life is stranger than fiction, or fiction can be concocted to be stranger than actual events?
I think the intriguing part of narrative nonfiction, if it's good, is that it is somehow better than fiction because it's true, at least from my perspective.
Yeah.
I love reading nonfiction. I don't read very much fiction. That's just my personal preference. And honestly, for the book that I wrote, I am not imaginative enough to have come up with what I wrote. I I write about the dark underbelly of the federal prison system, prison gangs and hit orders, and so many things that were never on my radar that I would never have wanted to research and look up to even try to become familiar with it. So, from that standpoint, truth is definitely stranger than fiction in my world.
So, if you could have a dream interview with a journalist you've admired or a figure that exists in the world, a dream interview, who would it be? Who would you love to sit down with?
A dream interview. I suppose because Woodstein, as they called them, Woodward and Bernstein, maybe I could go to lunch with both of them
Yeah.
and pick their brain because they're still around. Truman Capote, of course, is not still around. Yeah, I would love to get inside Carl Bernstein's head and ask about his sources, and same with Bob Woodward. Who, not that they would ever reveal their sources, but they're very connected, and I'm sure they have assistants and people that help them. But I would love to pick their brains about their writing process, their research process. Um, yeah, that would be fun.
The one thing that blows me away is Woodward's gotten pretty inside with Trump, and he's never flattering, but Trump keeps letting him in. Have you ever wondered why that happens? Is there a level of masochism? Is there I don't understand what that is. Is it because he's such a big name? Because it's happened on a number of occasions, because usually presidents and dignitaries will relent after they get a bad review or a book or whatever, but it seems like he always gets invited on the inside.
I guess because the former ex-president and soon to be president again thinks that he can keep changing the landscape. What is that definition of insanity? You keep trying the same thing over and over and it doesn't change. I guess he thinks he can win him over, but I don't think that really happens.
Yeah, that's interesting. That is a very interesting take. And I would imagine that would happen when you have a level of ego that we know exists.
Hmm.
So let me ask you this. What is the motivation for you? What was the motivation as a journalist to continue to be in a world that's pretty heavy? And what is the motivation for you now as a writer and bringing these stories to light? What is that gets you up every day to do this?
Well, I didn't set out to write this book at all. I mean, it just kind of came upon me because my high school friend, Scott Powell, brought me into his criminal case, and he was defending Kevin Sanders in a prison stabbing. And one thing led to another. My friend Scott convinced me, hey, this is a great true crime story. He knew about my journalism background. He said, you have a front row seat to the best true crime story going on. And it seemed like a good idea for a while, but I got personally involved in Kevin's unsavory world, just by virtue of association. And there were a lot of times I didn't want to write the book, dropped the book, and then I'd pick it back up, and then things would happen and I'd drop it. And so I eventually felt the time was right, and I felt it was safe enough to write under a pen name and with some of the players' names changed and locations, which my publisher was very accommodating for. But that book just kind of occurred because it seemed to be the right thing to do. And I was imparting important information about criminal justice and the prison system that needed to get out there and have that story get told. So now that that's out, I feel good about that. And I'm ready to move on to some other projects, books that I have outlined, one of which we just discussed. I mentioned it in Chain Birds, and it was a story of a love triangle from the 1970s that happened in Northeast PA that came up again in the 90s with the exhumation of a body and an autopsy. And I'm ready to write my version of that story. But I've got some other nonfiction book ideas that don't necessarily involve dead bodies. And just looking forward to getting more stories out there.
So you've obviously lived a life of covering, heavy things, dark things, and just a myriad of different stories. So let's say you have a dream tonight, you run into that version of you before you enter the journalism world, and you have all these ideologies and dreams floating, and you can give that version of you a piece of advice based on this life you've led, the wisdom you've gained along the way. What advice would you impart on that young version of you?
Hmm. I think I would say don't be afraid, go with your gut, don't second guess yourself. And a lot of that comes with age. We do tend to get a little wiser as we get older. So it's not necessarily natural for a younger person to have that perspective, but I think that's what I would say.
So, of everything that you've covered as a journalist and your book and all of these adventures that you've been on, what is it that you're the proudest of?
I think the final release of this book, because it did take me over 10 years to write, and I had to overcome some feelings of security, personal safety issues, safety for the inmate at the heart of the book, and for my attorney friend Scott, to overcome that and feel that I have put out a truthful, important story that reveals a lot about our society. That that's it.
So, as obviously somebody that has journalism in their blood, you love to go after the story. If you could get into a time machine and go back into the annals of American history and cover a story firsthand, what story would that be?
I think it would have been fascinating to be someone closer to the epicenter and on the ground during 9/11. I watched that from my television in my bathrobe, and my neighbor came down the street in her bathrobe, and our kids were off at school, and we were glued. And I was not a working journalist full time at that point. I was just doing some freelancing. Uh, but I think that would have been fascinating to be part of that. I
It's
think
interesting. That may have been the one moment in the collective American history in my lifetime that was probably the most traumatic. And I've kind of thought it a little bit, but it never hit me until you said that, just listening to you talk about it. I was backpacking in Europe. I flew to Paris on the 4th of September, just in my 20s, just going to Europe, just, having a good time. And I ended up in the back of a water taxi on the morning of 9/11 in Venice, Italy, and a guy in the boat just kept shooting his arms in the air and kept saying Nuevo York, looking at me like I was crazy. Because when I traveled, I never called home. I just disconnected. I was just, and that was pre-real serious internet. You still had calling cards. Lira was still around. There was all of these things that were different. And I remember I had a fight to get back home. After that, I went to Vernazza, Italy, and it was beautiful. It was a paradise there. It was like an old hippie commune, and everybody was happy. And I'm like, how can this be happening? Like, everybody was just living their lives, enjoying it by the Baltic Ocean. And anyway, I ended up having to get back to America via Gatwick and London because my flight from Paris to Kansas City just didn't exist anymore. So I remember really having to fight and talking to my dad like I was in a Hemingway novel. He was like, hold on to that passport, it's gold, and just the way people were treating us and trying to be understanding. Anyway, I just it's interesting. That was a very, very interesting time in our history.
Oh, surreal, actually. And think about the younger generation that doesn't have memory of that.
Yeah.
That exists in history for them. Maybe they'll, see a documentary about it sometime or references, but it's fading in memory for a lot of people.
I remember I used to run couple computer labs for the YMCA back in the early 2000s, and I would bring up like Three's Company or Good Times, and they'd look at me with like deer in headlights.
You just dated yourself, Joe,
I
but I
know I
know those
did.
shows very well.
So at the end of the day, everyone out there, Carla, has a perception of you, family, friends, all of your readers, everyone that knows you, but you ultimately run the show. What is your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Well, right now, I would say I'm pretty much a nobody. This book was just released, and I'm just certainly a faceless author name to go with the story. Maybe eventually I'll be known as someone who brought this story to the public square, and there's no way to not participate in that, in fairness to my publisher. But I don't mind at all if I get to go back to my regular life too. I'm a wife, I'm a mom, I play pickleball, I have great family, friends, community, and life is short. I'm just enjoying the moment and everything that comes with it, and trying to be appreciative for all the good things.
Well said. So the book is Chained Birds, a true crime memoir by Wild Blue Press. If anyone wants to pick up a copy or learn anything more, where's the best place to get people to go?
Well, you can look up Chained Birds really easily on Amazon. I've been blogging about the book and my publishing journey on my blog, which is carlajeanconti.com. And all my social media handles are Carla Jean Conti.
Okay, Carla, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for your story. It's fascinating.
Joe, thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for tuning in to another famous interview with Joe Dimino, where we cover the world of art, literature, business, spirituality, music, and more from around the globe. Our esteemed theme music was composed and produced by the great E.E. Pointer of Kansas City's River Cow Orchestra. If you want to hear more interviews, visit the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino channel on YouTube. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.